Welcome, everyone, to our series, Facing Inequality. I'm James Foster, co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, at George Washington's Eliot School of International Affairs in our nation's capital. It's a distinct pleasure being here with you for today's presentation, Hidden Wealth, by Neil Cummins of the London School of Economics. I want to thank Professor Cummins for being here today to explain how he uses historical methods to improve our understanding of wealth inequalities and how they have evolved through time. We're also pleased to have with us today two leading figures in the national statistical system of the United States, Marina Gundelski of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and Jonathan Rothbaum of the Census Bureau. Thank you for returning to GW and lending your expertise in extracting pictures of inequality from data. I'll be the moderator of today's conversation, which is being co-sponsored by the Departments of Economics and History and the GW Interdisciplinary Inequality Series. I would like to also thank the Executive Circle of my institute and its co-chairs, Deborah Lair and Frank Wong, for their support, which helps make events like today's possible. Now, for those of you who've never attended an IEP event, either online or in person at the Eliot School of International Affairs, you can expect an informative and nonpartisan exchange of views on topics like digital trade, global governance, US-China economic relations. Our Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series recently featured Steve Killalay, the originator of the Global Peace Index, for a discussion of peace and well-being. And our neighbors at the IMF recently presented their flagship publication, The World Economic Outlook, here at IIEP. And we'll also discuss their Global Financial Stability Report in May. While on Friday, our very own Stephen Kaplan will present his book on China and the Americas. Next week, our Monday multidimensional measurement series with Oxford and UNDP features Niels Grede of the World Food Programme and Felix Schmeiding of the World Bank, discussing how Turkey's social net program impacts multidimensional poverty of refugees. If you miss any event, you can catch it later on our YouTube channel, IIEP GW, and today is the 12th in our Facing Inequality series, which actually began last May with Branko Milanovic discussion of global income inequality, and most recently brought Betsy Stevenson to DC for a discussion of gender inequality. Be on the lookout in May for our next Facing Inequality event on the wealth of politicians with Georgetown's Marco Klosnia of the School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government. Now, here to describe the Facing Inequality series and introduce the speakers is GW historian and IIEP affiliate, Trevor Jackson. Hi, Trevor, how's the book going?
Hi, James. I have the same attitude towards the book as Macbeth had towards murdering people, which is to say initial enthusiasm followed by greater and greater alarm. So I'm here to introduce the Facing Inequality series and the happy task of introducing our speaker and our discussants. So this actually began in the before times in a conversation between myself and GW Econ professor Brian Stewart, who was also an affiliate of IIEP. And normally discussions between historians and economists focus on the differences between our disciplines, but together we realized that inequality, in addition to being one of the most salient political and policy challenges of our time, was also a subject that might bring us together. That since the runaway bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty that came out in 2014, more and more economists have devoted their interest towards questions of inequality and distribution. And at the same time, more and more historians have realized that although few of us think that we work on inequality, there's a case to be made that in fact, that's the only thing we work on. So we realized that inequality might be a subject for interdisciplinary discussion. And we began what was then called the GW Interdisciplinary Inequality Seminar, funded by the kind people in OVPR. And last spring, when the pandemic suspended our operations, we found a home in IIEP and became the Facing Inequality series, which has actually allowed us a wider breadth of cross-disciplinary discussions and an ability to reach people both within and outside of the academy. And so today, Facing Inequality brings together historians, economists, sociologists, political scientists, and epidemiologists, both within the academy and without, to present their work and discuss ideas that can facilitate new interdisciplinary approaches to the problem of inequality, with a special interest in perhaps finding a language and a set of methodologies that can bring us together. So today we are very happy to welcome Neil Cummins, who is an associate professor of economic history at the London School of Economics. Neil's work uses recently digitized historical genealogical data to answer big questions about the origin of modern economic and demographic behavior, including fertility decline in France and England, plague mortality in 17th century London, and social mobility over the very long run. He made quite a splash in a 2017 paper that analyzed the death dates of over 100,000 European elites over the course of 1,000 years. And in a 2019 paper, he used 60 million English death and probate records to examine the decline of the middle class in England over the very long 20th century. Today, he will be talking to us about his research into hidden wealth. He'll be followed by our two discussants. Up first will be Marina Gundelski, who has her PhD in economics from our own George Washington University and is now a research economist at the Bureau of Economic Analysis. She previously worked at the World Bank. Her research focuses mostly on measuring inequality in national accounts and on improving the measures of distributional income that we have. Following her will be John Rothbaum, who also has his PhD in economics from GW and is now chief of the income statistics branch in the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division of the US Census Bureau, where he studies things like intergenerational mobility. So as James says, two leading experts on the statistical infrastructure for thinking about these questions. So with no further ado from me, I will turn it over to Neil and then we'll follow with our discussion. So Neil, take it away.
Great. Okay, well, first off, thank you so much. This is a great opportunity to present research that I'm just incredibly excited by, and it's just great to have this platform to disseminate this research and to also maybe get your feedback. Like all research, these are kind of best all science educated guesses at things that we find hard to measure, and I hope that this is at least looking at things in a slightly novel way. The wider context for this research is a broad attempt at collecting historical big data to characterize the trajectory of inequality in much higher resolution than we have in the past. And if you look at some of the working papers I've put out from this project, the kind of great promise of this line of research is exploiting individual nominal records to see what's actually happening at an individual level over, say, over several centuries in a country like England, which has, I'll admit, unusually nice data of this character. I'll hint, as we go through it, I want to just emphasize that it's quite in many ways a technical paper. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on the mechanics of the specific calculations, but I will give you a sense of the intuition behind each and every step that I employ to measure something which is, by definition, invisible. We're measuring this by shadows here. And the shadows that are cast, I think, paint a pretty compelling, to me, picture. So the kind of core data that's allowing me to see the shadows of hidden wealth in England over the past 100 years or so are the individual entries of the Principal Probate Registry Index, which I have digitized over the past few years. This record source records all wealth passing at death above a very kind of low threshold. And by collecting this together, as I'll show you in the paper, I'm able to estimate this hidden wealth. I get a figure for wealthy elites that at least 20%. What I estimate is a plausible minimum is how I define it. And what's interesting about this measure, which I measure at a kind of dynastic or family level, is that if you throw this into a model looking at contemporary outcomes, so hidden wealth since 1920 accumulating to today, and you look at that in a model predicting contemporary inequalities, such as the value of the house that people are living in, which we can know from the electoral roll, which I've also digitized, and also attendance at the elite universities of Oxford and Cambridge, where you can see who's at those universities by scraping their email directories. What's also compelling about this, for me anyway, is that this measure of hidden wealth is predictive in a linear model sense of being mentioned in the offshore banking leaks, those of Appleby, Mossack Fonseca, of 2013 to 2016. So there's suggestive evidence here. Nothing's causal here, you know, and for the econometricians, this is all descriptive. But I think these patterns demand an explanation. And my explanation is that this is hidden wealth that's subsequently used for consumption that isn't being seen by the UK tax authorities or probate authorities. What's incredibly intriguing, because this is a plausible minimum, is that if you adjust wealth shares, the famous, you know, story of Piketty and lots of other scholars, where we see the decline of the top 1%, the decline of the top 10% over the 20th century. If you put this hidden wealth back in, you eliminate about 1/3 of that decline. And because that's, in this paper, estimated as some sort of a minimum, it leaves open this very intriguing possibility that the entirety, and you know, this is a provocative conclusion and is not justified by the numbers, but it's in this direction, that what we see in the 20th century, at least when it comes to wealth inequality, which remember is the biggest element of overall socioeconomic inequality, is far greater Gini coefficients than income inequality, that could perhaps be illusory, because everything we know about the 20th century's decline in wealth inequality is based on declared wealth information. And so I find that intriguing possibility and something that we really need to look at. So, again, I look through the kind of individual level data. I'm able to look at dynasties defined as those with unusual names that represent small family groups. And of my sample, which is around about 36,000 different dynasties, I found about 8,500 dynasties that themselves are responsible for about 7.7 billion pounds of missing wealth. Now, this is not the population level estimate. This is just what I find for these specific families. But it implies, again, that 20% or so of all wealth is hidden legally or illegally. It's a very holistic definition of hidden, which I'll get to as we go through this. Let me immediately paint the picture of what I do. This is the wealth to debt for a dynasty. I'm not going to name them for obvious reasons, and I'll explain why as we go through this. But this dynasty, I find that between 1892 and around 1920, that wealth, the average wealth of debt is extremely high. And if you look at that, there's one testator dying in around 1905 that has around 12 million pounds in 2015 English pounds that dies. But what's intriguing about this, the history of this dynasty, is that you would expect, if this family was inheriting that money, that some sort of remnant of that should show up in the probate registers as we go through the 20th century. Now, of course, anything could have happened here. It could all have been consumed. A son could have inherited the 12 million and gone to Monte Carlo and put it all on black, right? So the major point of what I do here is that for any dynasty, there's a whole bunch of idiosyncratic different stories that you could tell of where the money went that have may or may not have anything to do with it being hidden. But the paper makes the following proposition, that at the group level, these idiosyncratic shocks will average 0. So when you see, for say, certain kind of rich groups of the population that wealth is systematically missing, and that's not attributable to the random part nor to consumption, that's the part that I propose is hidden. Okay, and this is also why I don't name the names, because life is life and random things happen. You know, people have all sorts of crazy things happen to them. That's why life is so interesting. But here's a visual display of the maths in the paper. So you have between 1890 and 1920 a relatively low tax regime in England. which extends back to the beginning of tax in England, right? It's only really post 1920, and really, and I'll show you this data post 1950, that you get the implementation of very high inheritance tax at death. And what's interesting here is that if you look at these dynasties, okay, which I follow over time from the individual level data, you're able to kind of collect what their kind of observed wealth is, say between 1890 and 1920 in this low tax era. And then what I can do is I can project that pot of money forward, okay, at the rate of return of capital in the economy, okay? And then I can also take out how much inheritance tax they pay, okay? And then I'm able to compare this estimated trajectory with what I actually observe from their descendants in the probate registry, okay? Now, what I propose is by grouping these guys into different kind of wealth groups, the top 10% and so forth, that you can compare these differential paths and see where there is wealth that is systematically missing over time. So I'm sure you have lots of questions. How my planned presentation will proceed is I'm going to explain all the different elements to this. What feeds into this is basic intuition, but it's a lot more complicated, obviously, than what I just explained. So let me take you through everything. And at each step, I have contributed, I've taken some existing work that's out there, but also added many different new historical estimates that feed into this. The context is, of course, as I mentioned, the decline of the very top wealth shares, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, as I'm showing you here. I have a separate paper, which Trevor alluded to on the middle class, where I'm able to take this data and ask, we know these wealth shares decline from the work of Anthony Atkinson, for example, but where did it go? Where in this paper, which is recently come out in the Journal of Economic History, I show that went entirely to the rest of the top 30% and primarily the rest of the top 20%. And you don't see any growth in the wealth share of the middle of the wealth distribution. Now, in writing that paper, I got into lots of back and forth with economic historians about what on earth middle class actually means. And then there is a large number of slippery definitions. But in terms of the US interpretation of middle class, like say a middle part of the wealth distribution, you just don't see that emerge in England, which I thought was actually a pretty interesting novel result too. We also have RG dynamics, rate of return on capital, the growth rate of the economy. The interplay of these is supposedly diluting the wealth shares, but I've actually got new data on the variable rate of return on capital by wealth, which actually I think might undermine some of the story and will provide, I think, hopefully a jumping off part for the discussion and potentially a new direction for this work. And also the political economy here, I've also got new estimates of the different levels of marginal tax on wealth at death that I'll show you, but this is just for the context that I told you before, that before around 1900, you're seeing really a glorious, for some, tax-free regime in England that really is dramatically reversed, where you get a top marginal tax rate of close to 80% on all wealth post Second World War. In many ways, this discontinuous change in terms of a generational perspective is the identification strategy of the paper, okay? So it's not coming in like a typical research discontinuity design on a date of death. It's coming in on an era of death. But if you compare those dynasties' wealth trajectories before this hike and afterwards, that's essentially another kind of way of summarizing what the strategy of the paper is. There's a whole load of literature that is extremely important that I relate to, particularly on English wealth. And Thomas Piketty's work is where we're all working in the shadow of his monumental contributions over the past 2 decades. Peter Linders, of course, fellow economic historian, but also people like Anthony Atkinson, also his recent paper with Alvarado Moretti, and also economic historians such as Scott, recent paper. Of course, this relates most directly to the work of Gabriel Zuckman, who has really become one of the academics who is tackling this issue of hidden wealth across the world through various different contributions. The paper this most directly relates to is the paper that analyzes the HSBC data leak for about 600 different account holders. So they were looking at one bank in one country, but the results actually mirror what they find very precisely. So my work has suggested that it's complementary. There's no real contradiction. How could there be? We're looking at different places, different times, very different definitions, but it's in this vein. So the contribution, I'm going to try and make this as compelling as possible in terms of a presentation. I'm very much a data guy in terms of economic history. And I've collected here a large number of databases I've been working on for many years, in particular with some co-authors. And I think there's a nice way that they've layered. Some of these have been, of course, directly constructed for this analysis too, but let me go through them in order of importance here. The first piece here, which is I'm writing several papers and potentially a book on, is this mass digitization of all wealth passing in England and Wales from 1858 now to 1992, and actually I can actually get a measure of someone's wealth right the way up till 2020. So this is now going from 1858 to 2020, although this paper only uses 1892 to 1992 because of the definition of wealth to 1992 that I use, but potentially there's scope to extend this back to 1858. And the Probate Index, as I said, records all those who die with wealth above a minimum threshold. This threshold is around about £10 in 1900 and is £5,000 today, and has been since 1984. Although there are lots of, as you can imagine, difficulties with interpreting that as £5,000 after 2000, after the year 2000, more or less, which I discussed in my recent JH piece. But it's a relatively low threshold in terms of assets. And what's amazing is that the vast majority of people don't have anything. And I think this element has been somewhat neglected in studies of wealth distributions in the past. We've really focused on the top wealth shares because that's where we see money. But in terms of estimating what's going on at the middle of the distribution, it's remarkable. This is the proportion of debts. I also have all the debts, so I'm able to calculate this, that make it into the data. And so you're seeing it being around about 10, 15% of all debts in, say, 1900. And then going to around 40% from 1950, and that has been flat since 1950 to today, more or less. What's interesting is that I got quite a lot of, people seem to be very surprised by that, unless you work with a lot of wealth surveys and you understand that actually most people don't have that much to invest, particularly in England, perhaps before 1970, 1980, 1990s, where asset distribution was relatively low, and you'll see some of that in the data as well as we go through it. I was going to go off on a whole tangent about the psychological origins of economists and economic historians as to how realistic this finding was, but I'm going to hold myself back on that as I realize that I have a lot of slides and a lot of material to go through. I built the data by digitizing it from the probate search service, which was put online and made the images searchable. So they were, I scraped them and downloaded them, around 1.5 different million image files. They all look like this. This is the page which has my own name, Cummins, and you can see the structure here of these records is very interesting. So from around about 1892 to 1992, they have exactly this structure. And that's what made the programmatic digitization of this possible. Now, I did this with no research assistance. I did this just pure coding in several different languages. From I'd worked with this database in joint work on social mobility with Greg Clark, so I was very familiar with the underlying data source, but the actual construction of this database was all done with code from my end. So I think that's, for economic historians, represents an interesting new frontier in which we can kind of go into now to create large historical big databases. So you can see the structure of the data there, and that structure of the data is really key in terms of what I do. I processed everything through an optical character recognition engine, and then when I had the resulting, what I would call dirty text data, I was able, which kind of, looks something like this, but this is actually very clean. You could see in bold, this structure was able to translate these entries into a database of rows and columns. So you could see, I've kind of explained the logic here, and this can be just actually written down very parsimoniously in several lines of code. The work is cleaning up all the dirty parts, where I actually detailed that in the Journal of Economic History paper, if you're interested. This is an example of some just notable entries that came across. Just in terms of doing this, if you're interested, see Benjamin Berry, who died in 1953. He never had a value filled in, but he has some sort of serial number that ends in a digit. So this was a real problem for me to get rid of these serial numbers. So I had to inspect a lot of these observations one by one, which was actually pretty interesting, to be honest. It's sometimes nice to eyeball data. You start thinking of things that you wouldn't have thought of before. A wild way to spend a Saturday night. This is Sir John Reeves Allerman, who's the richest person in the probate records in the entire sample period, who's quite elusive. When he died, the newspapers he owned wanted to publish a picture of him because he was dead and a notable individual, although not well known, but they couldn't find a photograph of him to publish in the papers, or they had great difficulty. And there's lots of aristocrats, and there's all these different amounts and so forth. So this summarized the process, lots of programming, quite techy, but that's the general gist of it. And then you get this database of 15 million wealth holders who have all sorts of different wealth estimates. You can see that these names, and this is the great thing about English names, as opposed to, say, Irish names, for example, if you haven't worked out I'm Irish, that they're unusually distinctive. England has a very large distribution of names, and that's what this paper exploits. And what's amazing, this new database matches what we know about top wealth shares very, very, very cleanly from recently polished estimates from Alvarado, Atkinson, and Morelli. These wealth shares match on, so it seems to validate that we're measuring the same thing, wealth inequality, and also by comparing it with, say, things like the Oxford savings studies from the 1950s, Lydell and Tipping here, and then also estimates based from macro data that use some similar wealth and debt data, but also use a lot of other measures. The concordance is quite striking as you go through this. Another thing that I do for this paper is I construct the death duty. This is the inheritance tax that would be paid on an estate of a decedent at death. And you've got a different schedule that's all applied in the method. And then that's just the table with the amount of tax people are paying. I also have recently added in the new revision of the paper variable rates of return for different quantiles of the wealth distribution. And this comes from new data, archival data, breakdowns of wealth to debt by asset type from the annual reports of the Commission of the Inland Revenue. And then I'm able to use the Oscar Jorda, Alan Taylor, Marit Schulerach estimates of the rate of return for different asset classes. So I'm gonna have to skip over some of this because my time is, I better push on a little bit. But you get these different asset compositions for different groups of wealth. And these are the rates of return. And there's an equation. And this is basically what you get. You get different rates of return by different wealth ranges. I previewed this at the start, and I haven't really processed this yet, but just preparing this talk today, I was struck that if org dynamics are diluting the wealth share of the elites, it's not really consistent with what we're seeing in terms of this rate of return by wealth category. What you can see after 1950 is that those who are richer have a far higher rate of return than those who are poor, because those who are poor primarily hold their wealth in cash. Okay, and so like these asset classes, particularly in this period, are generating high returns, and you can see that it's not completely linear over the wealth distribution. You can see that people over 5 million don't necessarily have the top rate of return, and this is probably driven by the explosion in say house prices over this period, which is driving the other groups. But this is all applied to the wealth data. I have the Offshore Leaks Database, which I discussed already. I have estimates of contemporary outcomes for dynasties from the electoral roll, which gives everybody street address. And I'm able to use the postcode, which is a very highly disaggregated measure. Anyone who's spent time in London or lived here will know that postcode says a lot about you. It's about 2 million postcodes in this country. And you can see that how that measures contemporary dynastic outcomes and also attendance at Oxford and Cambridge universities. So let's look at some wealth trajectories. We have here the Cumminses, which is a relatively common name, typical. You see they're relatively poor, relatively an Irish name, and then kind of getting richer as you go through time, like the average member of the population. Here's a very elite group, very derivative of my name, Cummins, Norman name, and they're much richer, but just seem to be kind of tracking the rest of the general population. Here is a suspicious trajectory, okay? But you'd expect this to happen. There's not necessarily anything hidden here. Again, it's the grouping that will judge it as being hidden. This who have anonymized their name, there seems to be wealth missing that you would expect these people to have as you go through the post-1950 period, and also for this group as well. And here's a group that is very, very poor, but then becomes very rich. So as you go through each of these families, these are kind of unusual names, like Dumpleton's, not many people with that name. And what I do is I look at surname dynasties. These are names shared by 2 to 100 people in 1881. So these are just basically very small or medium-sized extended families, okay, representing about 1 million people in 1881, 2.5 million in 2002. And as I said, I was going to look at groups. So what I do is I take the top 1,500 of these very sharply defined surname dynasties, and I track them over time, okay? So there can be idiosyncrasies, okay, but I'm assuming that those idiosyncrasies net out to be 0 at the group level, okay? And what I show here is that when you look at this surname level, it mirrors the individual level. So it's capturing this dilution of the wealth share of the top 1%, the top 10%. So we use that as the unit of analysis in this paper. And here's some extra detail, which I'll kind of skip over because I'm getting very conscious of the time. I also measure wartime destruction, which I'll also skip over. And I promised you that I wouldn't spend too much time on these equations, but you can look at them if you're interested. And I'm very happy to explain the logic behind everything. And it's all as simple as I can make it. So basically, I'm going to skip over wartime destruction. But let's have a look at how the method works. So I'm just like I explained at the start, I'm estimating a wealth trajectory based on accumulated wealth from 1892 to 1920, okay? And then I'm just seeing how that grows, okay, over the 20th century. Now, what you see for everyone, okay, that basically it's kind of matching more or less the aggregate trajectory of wealth until we get till about 1980, where the asset price explosion, the 1980s, leads to the observed wealth being way in excess than what you would have predicted. And also there's going to be new wealth being created. Of course, not all wealth is created. I mean, that's what a modern economy is supposed to be doing, right? So that's why this line, this black line is above this red line. But the takeaway from the paper, one of the primary takeaways, is that you get this elite Victorian lineage. This is the top 1,500 surname dynasties. These are the real top 1%. Okay, they're rare names, so I can identify them as being unusually rich. Okay, by their surname type. Wealth generally tends to be transmitted in families. Okay, and the name is the tracker in this individual level data. What's amazing, as opposed to this other group, is that post 1950, you get a very sharp deviation from what previously the estimate was kind of matching pretty well. And systematically, this gap between the red line and the black line, or the red line and this gray line, where I've factored in how much would have been paid in those inheritance tax schedules. Okay, there's that gap is the hidden wealth, and that actually matches when, you know, over this period to around about 20 to 30% for this group. But what you'll see is variation by surname lineage. Now, if that was just idiosyncratic and random, or if this was all just conspicuous consumption of very expensive furniture for apartments, very bad taste furniture for apartments, for example, you know, you would expect this not then to be correlated with contemporary outcomes. And I'll show you later that it actually is correlated with contemporary outcomes. And you can measure this by decade. You can see there's actually wealth is actually, you know, the portion is negative during these 30s and 40s periods, but you're getting an estimate between, you know, sometimes 30%, 21%, 32%, 20% for this very elite group. Okay, again, you can look at this by the proportion hidden by different shares of the wealth percentile groups by generation. I'm seeing different things. You can see that the top 10% are hiding the most. This is in line with what we saw from the HSBC bank link. But I mean, it's not totally the case. In 1920 to 1950, the top 10%, which is this dark blue line, are actually not hiding that much at all. I have personal theories that maybe perhaps the war effort, my own work on the aristocracy, they're basically descended from warriors and given these titles and positions because of their comparative advantage in organizing and executing violence. This is their ancestors, that maybe the war efforts, where a lot of them died in the First World War, that perhaps there was some compulsion to actually pay for the damn thing through war bonds, perhaps, and so forth. But these are just idle speculations. But as you see, as you go through time, the elite groups start to have this missing wealth, but it's not mechanically a result of the method, because it doesn't seem to show up in this first period at all. And so I've got some extra details, but to kind of give you a sense of where these outcomes are going, I'm able to, again, I appreciate we've got an interdisciplinary audience that mightn't appreciate regression equations, but essentially the idea is to look at a bunch of outcomes that I've already previewed. The house you live in your descendants live in today, in the year 2000, for example, how is that related to this hidden wealth calculation that I'm proposing? And also the attendance rate at Oxford and Cambridge universities, and also whether someone, as we'll see first, this rare surname actually shows up in the database leaks of the offshore account holders. They weren't account holders, they were offshore companies, offshore entities, but these are the summary stats for this estimate. Again, let me just, like, these are just regression coefficients for a bunch of different formulations. The dependent variable is whether a surname, this is all at the surname level. So I've got about 16,000 different surnames that make it into this regression because of different data constraints, but they appear in the Paradise papers. These leaks are not 1, 0. And this is related to aspects of the surname, whether that surname is in the top 10% of wealth surnames, top 80th to 90th percentile, top 70th to 80th. And also then I simultaneously include this measure of hidden wealth and also the number of people holding that surname in 2002. And what you see, just to kind of balance this in your mind, you see a very strong influence of being in the top 10%. These are odds ratios. So you're getting one is, you know, there's no effect, but you're seeing there's about a 40% effect of being in the top 10%. You're 40% more likely to appear in the Paradise papers. And what's striking about this is if you put in this measure of hidden wealth, particularly if the hidden wealth is, say, above 1 million in the way I've calculated, it's actually 50% more likely to appear. But that's on top of this 36% effect that we had before. So there's a very minor attenuation of that top 10% effect, but you're getting extra information that in many ways is orthogonal to the information provided by the fact that you're rich. And I have lots of different wealth controls here. Again, the argument is not that it's causal, it's a correlation But I think the interpretation of the correlation is incredibly important. And if you think that this is all measuring some latent factor, some wealth, that you measure wealth imperfectly, so you just have another measure of wealth, you would expect that to somewhat, this coefficient would probably stop in value. I mean, it's my interpretation for sure of this data. And it basically, you can see, for all these different dynasties, if you look here, this is the number of people that are alive with these different names today. And this is the amount of declared wealth and the amount of hidden wealth. Now, again, for any one of these dynasties, it would be reckless, dangerous, and frankly stupid to think of this as conclusive evidence that they are hiding. But, okay, if you're looking for hidden wealth, this is a good place to start, okay? So the method works at a group level, but at an individual level, it's a probability. At an individual dynastic level, don't think that I'm even pretending to claim that this is robustly identifying. Remember those idiosyncratic shocks? Life is full of, it's just a series of idiosyncratic shocks, but gravity tends to operate no matter how strong your leg muscles are, or despite what glitches in the matrix occur to you. So I'm very conscious I have very few minutes left. Let me try and wrap up. The point about this hidden wealth measure is that it predicts appearance in the Paradise Papers, but it also predicts the value of the house you're living in, your descendants are living in the year 2000. And this is, if you're in the top 10%, you live in a house that's £90,000 more expensive on average than someone who's not in the top 10%. But if I throw in that hidden wealth measure, that effect stays pretty much exactly the same, but you're now living in a house that's worth an extra £100,000 if you've got more than £1 million of hidden wealth in your dynasty lineage. And again, it's also showing up in the relative effect on your descendants' appearance in the email directory for Oxford and Cambridge students today. And this is quite a large effect. Again, we're measuring the same thing in all of these tables. The story is the same. You get an effect of wealth, but you also get extra information from this hidden wealth measure. Okay, the interpretation here, again, I talk about it, it's not satisfying any causal identification, but these correlations are incredibly interesting, and we need to explain them if we want to understand what's going on with the 20th century wealth distribution. And let me leave you with this. The most important kind of takeaway is, how does this tell us at the group level, pretty much everywhere, we get a decline in the wealth share of the top 1%. Now, the ability to hide wealth is going to be correlated with wealth. So it's perfectly possible that there has been no change in the wealth concentration over the 20th century. And the great leveling, great equalization, whatever you want to call it, doesn't, that is just illusory. And I think this paper, which estimates a very kind of, I'm trying to err in a minimum direction, I'm just entering a plausible minimum, suggests that at least 1/3 of the observed decline is illusory and attributable to elites just switching their portfolio around. Some of it's going to be potentially offshore, and I've got some thoughts of that in the latest paper, but some of it is just going to be things like inter vivos bequests and perfectly legal rearrangement. For instance, the Grosvenor family, which is a very elite family in England, has a trust, and famously upon the death of their scion recently paid almost no inheritance tax. So this is part of a much larger project, and I'd love to be able to talk about that sometime soon, but I think I'll leave it there, and I'm very much looking forward to the comments and any feedback you have. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for your incredibly interesting discussion of how someone might go through and dig out information that's there but not used in the way that you intended. It's just amazing that you could pull out such information. I want to hear from the discussants, so I'm not going to say anything more. Let's begin with Marina Gundelski. Marina?
Thank you. Let me share my slides. Neil, thank you so much for your talk. I was really looking forward to it. I cite you several times in my own economic history work with Remy Jedwab, another GW person, and I have found all of your papers that I read to be extremely interesting and well-researched. And the common theme is that you managed to gather this very interesting historical data. And I hadn't yet seen that sort of individual level historical data applied in an income inequality context, the same way it has been applied in things like death certificates and whatnot in the fertility and mortality research that I do. So it was a super interesting read for me to see it applied in this context. My quick disclaimer that these are my thoughts and not those of the BEA or the Department of Commerce. So as I said, an incredible rich data set. I know that with econ history, one of the primary contributions is literally the data set. It's the big kahuna in the paper, not just what you do with it. And of course, when we talk about this kind of data, we start to say things like correlation and what we can get from that, as opposed to trying to show like the most identified causal regression. But it is a very significant contribution. And the term like great equalization was of a lot of interest to me. This idea is a little bit different in the UK and the US in terms of the patterns of wealth over time. And it was interesting to read the detail about the UK. Of course, you have the application of the R is greater than G, which forms the basis of your analysis of how people build wealth. And I was interested to see the World War discussion, that it did not eliminate the Victorian wealth, like it took a hit, but the decomposition of how the war affected people at different income levels was very interesting. And I hadn't seen that previously. I had that question immediately when I started reading your paper, because I knew that there was significant capital loss as a result of the world wars in Europe. So this is your picture that I found probably the most striking, sort of where did the wealth go? And as you explained, with the incidence of the tax, we sort of saw the elimination of the reported wealth. And as you said yourself, it's a correlation. As we see the tax incidence go up, the propensity to hide goes up. This is consistent both with other data that we've seen and consistent with economic theory. So I wanted to get to my discussion a little bit. You presented the paper so clearly, I don't want to spend too much time rehashing it, but we have all these lessons from the US income literature, and some of it is a little bit similar to the UK, other is a little bit different. And so what we know from the US literature is that there's a significant amount of tax evasion for the income side, right? But it's not equal for all types of income. So we know that the income that is observed sort of from the employer side as well as from the individual side is very well captured in the IRS. So things like wages and salaries, interest and dividends, we know it's very well reported, and it is costly to find tax evasion. I think I read yesterday there's a proposal to fund the IRS to actually investigate tax evasion further. And that really ties in with your paper, because the question is, if something is hidden, how do we find it? And of course, we would need a lot of resources to investigate where that wealth is if we wanted to tax it, or where that income is if it's offshore in another account. So the higher the income is, the more ways there are to misreport it. And of course, that goes double for things like assets, right? When you think of properties in other countries or offshore accounts, as your database was showing. So we know that, that there was efforts to increase sort of compliance in tax returns. That is to say, the way in which people report being actually accurate. And they found that about $1 billion, Jansen et al. Found that $1 billion of the tax revenue was actually tied to their sort of increased enforcement mechanisms. About a decade ago, they did a study on this, but they still found significant non-compliance. So a question is, if we actually increase the rate at which we can collect these incomes and increase our reporting accuracy, what kind of revenue would that actually generate? And this study had found for the US that it looked like about $1 billion of extra revenue tied to the compliance, tied to the increased compliance and enforcement that was done at that time. Now, I'm sure there's still a lot of room for improvement. I've spoken with some people at the IRS that actually look at the results of these audits. They have papers on both what is found by the audits, and then further speculation on what portion of the income is still hidden, not found in the audits. And that proportion is very high for things like business income. About 50% they think is still missing even after the audits. So I wondered what kind of implication that sort of missing income would have for your wealth study, because that income, if it's missing from one person's returns, this is on a year-to-year basis, that would then sort of spiral, right? In the aggregate for generations, you would think that the return wouldn't simply be, right, the R sort of, right, the return to capital, but if they're actually hiding income of different types with different percentages, what would the return be to, say, business income as compared to something like interest and dividends, right? Different kinds of market returns. So I was interested to see if there was more nuance in your measure of R because of the different types of income hidden at different rates. And I'm showing you, there's a few papers of US evidence on those kinds of things. And as far as the international comparison, we know that there is tax competition across countries, right? Not just the concept of tax havens like the Caymans. Again, this has to do with what kind of income is being taxed where, but also just within Europe, different tax rates, people living across borders, right? To avoid paying a kind of income tax in one country and instead declaring it in another country, sort of legal ways to still evade taxes. With other international agreements, such as trade agreements, environmental agreements, we know there's been limited enforceability and accountability among countries, right? If you think of like even international fishing standards, we know there's a significant amount of cheating that ensues. If we had an international agreement to sort of limit the opportunities to hide this wealth, what do we think would be the effectiveness of such an agreement, right? And without such an agreement, if we were to sort of levy the wealth taxes that are under discussion right now, how would it be best to levy them and with what specificity in order to avoid these kinds of problems? Do you think it would be best to stick with like an inheritance tax and try to better measure the assets that are actually being passed on? Do you think it would be better to try to find the other sort of missing wealth, or to try to close international loopholes and how people are moving it around? I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that. I work on income primarily, so I haven't had a lot of experience trying to measure wealth, but I do know that it is significantly harder precisely because of the issues you raised and because of our measurements, right? There's very little incentive to actually report what your wealth is, even without a wealth tax, as it were. People still sort of anticipate that there'd be correlations between, well, I can't report a lot of wealth, but then not have a lot of income on my tax return, so I'm not going to tell you how much wealth I have either. So, right, the question is, you have sort of a model for how we would assume that the wealth would go from the 20s forward, right, 100 years to today, what it would look like, the R greater than G concept, and you have the individual returns that back up the assumptions of your model. What do you think would be a better way to measure the wealth than we currently have, which relies mainly on sort of individual small scale studies or on larger scale surveys, which is of course self-reporting and have a lot of issues there as well? And I'll stop there and let John continue.
Great, thank you so much, Marina, for giving us your insights from income and from actually that builds up wealth, obviously, so it's quite closely linked. Now, Jonathan Rothbaum from Census Bureau. John?
Okay, so I'll just echo Marina's comments. I really love this paper. The amount of data work that went into it, I mean, I work a lot with data. It's amazing, and you do some really interesting things with it. So yeah, the big questions, I don't need to belabor it because we've already heard two people say it. I mean, we have these observed wealth concentrations from administrative data. People have incentives that are very strong to hide that money because it's very expensive not to, which has implications for what true inequality is and what sort of wealth taxation would do. Again, the data is amazing. This, from an American's perspective, is just like really amazing to look at, that you have individuals tied to their wealth in a way that I think, for privacy reasons, you'd never see in America. And I work with administrative data. Even on presentations, I have to use fake names like the Simpson family because I don't want people to confuse them with even possible real people. And then all this other data with offshore leaks and Oxford and Cambridge attendance and housing prices. It's just so many different amazing pieces of data brought together. I'll sort of keep my comments brief and keep them to the parts of the, I love the paper, but I'll focus on the things where I have hopefully places I can add to things or help. For me, I don't know if I love the lower bound framing. There's sort of a lot of assumptions that go into that. And so when I think of lower bounds, I usually think of this as sort of the strongest assumption, the weak or the weakest assumption in some sense. And I think some of them are assumptions which there could be variation, like the risk-free return. This is something I think in the version I looked at that is different from what you were presenting a little bit, that you do try to distinguish between asset classes held, and that the rich may actually have a different return than the non-rich. And so and it does seem to go up as you move up the distribution in some places. And I also think it's worth noting that it is something you do note in the paper, but when you have higher taxes, it raises the incentive to evade them, but it also raises the incentive to consume. So if you can't leave 80% of your wealth to your kids, you might be more inclined to buy the Bentley or whatever it is, whatever sort of consumption item that could conceivably reduce the wealth of these very, very rich families. And going back to that heterogeneity point, there's a lot, even across within asset classes, there's a lot of heterogeneity in returns to wealth. And it seems to be relatively persistent, actually, looking at these papers. And I do not know how to say the name, so I'm not going to try for the first author in these papers. But the returns to wealth are heterogeneous, and they seem to even persist somewhat across generations, and that they tend to be higher for the wealthy, even within asset classes. I think, if I understand that literature correctly, that might be something you want to try to build in more than you maybe already have in the version that you're working on now versus the one I read. And I don't know, for consumption, I don't have a good sense for how that may vary too. And I also think this is something you did talk about, but this heterogeneity is going to imply some amount of measurement error in your regression. So I actually think it might be worthwhile to think maybe about sort of what are some reasonable assumptions about this measurement error, and what would that imply about a point estimate for the amount of wealth that's being hidden, and instead of a lower bound. And some things like, if you thought that $1 of wealth translated into Oxbridge attendance the same whether it was hidden or not, and that's a pretty strong assumption, because being able to hide your wealth may predict your ability to manipulate the system in a way that also, I don't know, UK university admissions, but if you thought that was true, and then you have some assumptions about the measurement error, the relative measurement error in the two wealth measures you have, that you might be able to sort of back out different, sort of with different levels of measurement error, point estimates for how much wealth is hidden. That might be kind of interesting. So that was sort of a suggestion. And then just sort of random comments, like, I don't know the UK system very well. Is there any notion of legacy preference, whether it's explicit like it is in American universities, or even implicit, that like even without $1 of current wealth, you could translate prior status, like having a person who attended Oxford in 1920, does that raise the probability of their child attending Oxford in 1990 conditional on not having any wealth, or even if your wealth is the same. Then house values, I mean, that's one way. I don't know if your assets include house values, but house values are a part of wealth that is observable. So I don't know if there's something weird, like it's sort of in your observable wealth category. And it also could have been purchased I don't know how much houses get passed down or turned over, but it's actually something that could have been purchased in 1920 and passed down. So having past wealth and buying a house in London that you couldn't afford today that may be related also, that's sort of separate from the non-house value current wealth. And then just sort of a general comment on the regressions. It might be nice to have observed wealth and hidden wealth sort of in the same terms. It's a little hard to interpret percentiles of observed wealth and then dollars or shares of hidden wealth. I know that there's lots of measurement error in both, but like in theory, if you thought of $1 as $1, you might want them on the same, whether it's log or inverse hyperbolic sign or some like similar unit across the two. That might be a little easier for me to interpret, sort of what are the different coefficients mean relative to each other. And I'll leave my comments with that.
Well, there you have it, Neil. A series of questions and comments that you'll have to respond to right now if you want to. I'll, in the meanwhile, just ask the people in the audience if they have any questions, and please, especially those who are in other disciplines than economics or even history, let us know what you think and let us know what your questions are. Fantastic. So I'm going to turn it back to Neil. Neil?
I've unmuted. Yeah, I should be good now?
Yeah, you're great.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks, Marina and John, so much. This has been, it's terrific. I mean, it's you give me a lot to think about, particularly on the specifics. I'll just give, I can only give very brief off the cuff kind of comments. So Marina, I took from 2 principal points. I think you were thinking about, you bring up this point that we observed that a lot of income is missing from US data. So how does that kind of factor in? Because that's going to like accumulate. I mean, I guess I'm not measuring any part of income, I'm measuring this wealth part. And I'm going to perfectly agree. That's kind of the idea. I think the identification of the paper, and it's maybe a misuse of the word identification, but screw it. And it basically is from the idea that the incentive to hide changed discontinuously pre and post the era of the world wars, say 1920, for example, just as an easy date. So I completely agree that lots of things are missing. But remember, here's the justification. Everything we know about the 20th century wealth distribution is based on declared data. So I think, you know, that's kind of exactly the point. So I completely accept what you're saying. I think your second point was more on, there's a lot of rich points there, but I would say the takeaway was, what are the implications for tax and policy, perhaps, of this finding? And I think that if you're looking for an easy interpretation of this that kind of has a political, that gives you kind of weight in any political dialogue, you're going to be frustrated, because on one hand, it reads like I'm out to get rich people on some level. That is not what this is saying. It's saying that if you raise taxes, you're not going to get the revenue because people are going to move their money around to not pay tax, right? So people, I've found that people are puzzled by this paper because they're trying to work out what where I'm coming from. And I think that both sides of the political spectrum can get ammunition from this and also can be frustrated by this. I think there are obvious things to say that if you did want to tax rich people, you'd want to do this at a global level. And I think that's also very much what everybody is saying. And in many ways, I think you alluded to this, if you tax rich people in your country, the money is just going to disappear because these people have the means. I mean, during the war, if you appear to their emotional sense, which I think there's data in this paper to support that descriptively. But I mean, I think that that the interpretation of this is kind of maybe is beyond the scope of the paper. I'm just documenting what's going on here, but I think it's a tricky one. And I think so you get 3 tax regimes in this paper: a low tax regime, a very, very high tax regime, and then a flat tax regime. And I think there could be some analysis here that you could look based on those discontinuity thresholds to see what's happening in some sort of policy. But I think I'd really need to work with someone who knew a lot more about tax and public economics than I do. Remember, I'm an economic historian who primarily works in demography. Okay, but thanks so much for these, and that they were not complete answers to you, but that's kind of the direction of what I was thinking when you rose those points. John similarly had lots of different points. The lower bound framing, I think, and I think you brought up consumption, and I think that's interesting. I've kind of dealt a little bit more with consumption in the latest draft. I'm basically assuming consumption away. I'm assuming that, you know, people consume their wealth, but they also add to it. And what you see from the work I have with Greg Clark is that if you look at the rankings of families over time, they going back to the Doomsday Book, 1,000 years, they're staying the same. And I think people are coming around to that, even though we got a lot of flack over the years for it. I mean, and so I'm appealing to that work in the sense of saying that I'm modeling consumption as, you know, and if you just look at like a lot of the you know, how wealth happens in families, so it's an assumption, and I think in the spirit of where you're going with this, the heterogeneity in terms of distribution, the rate of return, not some measurement error, I think these are kind of elements which I think I could kind of adjust in kind of a robustness check. And I think that one way to get at this, and in terms of how it feeds through to the regressions, like the easy answer is that if the hidden wealth estimates are just random noise, you know, it should be just washing out, and it should be easy to make those coefficients go away. But what you can do to satisfy the issues that you raise is that you can make slightly different assumptions, but you can also generate like a distribution of rate of returns, for example, for different dynasties. And I'm a big fan of bootstrapping, you know, like you can bootstrap this, but you can also just do simulations based on the observational characteristics and give people distributions and see how those spot estimates move around. I'm very much open to doing this, and I find this in my work. When you do a lot of data work, there's so many different elements. I'm kind of interested to see what is the one thing that people object to, and so maybe I'll look through and I'll need to think about this. And also your smaller points are just, yeah, make perfect sense, and I agree perfectly. But they're just my immediate comments on both of your points, which I appreciate greatly. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. And indeed, audience, please put your questions in the chat. We're going to go first to Trevor Jackson, who I believe is unmuted, correct?
I am indeed. Thank you, James. And thank you, Neil, for that. That was a real treat. And I think I learned a lot from it. And so my questions are more about the bigger picture connections of where you're going with the larger scale project, and kind of speak to something that you've just alluded to, which is to what extent there's churn in this elite over time, or whether it's stable, because there is a historiography that suggests that what's distinctive about the British elite is that it's relatively open, and that that's a source of social stability, because there's constant movement in and out that refreshes itself. And I wonder, you know, I've read your work with Clark, which seems very much to argue against that, but I wonder if there are discontinuities and moments of churn, whether it shows up in places or not, and like a moment in which the elite is kind of reconstituted. And I guess a smaller version of this, when I think about wealth destruction, and I think about going a bit earlier in time, one thing that comes to mind is the abolition of slavery. And so I wonder how much, or if it would be possible to figure out if particularly those idiosyncratic names of that Victorian elite, if they show up in the slave compensation database, for instance.
Got to mute myself every time. Thank you so much, Trevor. This is excellent. So just immediately on the slavery issue, absolutely. There are dynasties that we can identify as being disproportionately invested in slaveholding. And I'm actually working with some co-authors here at LSE looking at this. And part of this is just, when you look at this, it's very easy to kind of get those names. You know who those people are already. But what I'm kind of struggling to think of as a kind of an economist or an economic historian here is just, well, what's the interpretation? They're rich people, they've got an asset. The asset becomes illegal. They diversify into something else. And so the kind of framing I'm thinking of that is like unethical investment, you know, because there might be money on the table because this is an unfashionable investment. But like that means that if you just care about the money, you can go into this because I mean, the climate in London, even pre-abolition, was not socially acceptable to be, you know, abolition didn't come out of nowhere. Like people were not happy with this long before abolition. So I'm working on this, but just in a kind of more broader sense, the elite in England has a stunningly interesting marriage market, and it's very insular until, you know, as you go through time, it changes. You think of Winston Churchill's mother. Churchill was from a very aristocratic family of the Duke of Marlborough, and his mother was American. You see a lot of American wives coming into the UK elite scene. A lot of them are actually Irish American, yada yada. But the fact of the matter is, and I have the data, I can show you the correlation between spouses in marriage, and this is work with Greg Clark, where we've digitized virtually all available marriage records in England, going back to actually 1540, but we do this for the 19th century to today, and you can find using, which I think is going to have people are going to be very interested in. That's kind of many ways intellectually a follow up to our social mobility work. You can find that the underlying correlation in marriages is in the region of 0.8. Like there's a huge fixity. And if you actually look at projects like Stanford Stanford's project on digital humanities, you can see that the English elite is consistently marrying very tightly over the whole time. Famously, the families of Malthus, Darwin, Galton, they're all marrying each other's cousins. Malthus famously worried about this, or Darwin worried about his children being inbred and so forth. And this is something which we kind of know, but we haven't seen the data on, and that's where actually a lot of this is going. Because social mobility, if you just have elites marrying other elites, that's one of the main levers of why mobility is so slow in England. But thanks for the question.
Great. Now, Peter Deitch, I see you there. Do you want to go ahead and just speak through your question, or would you like me to be your mouthpiece?
I'm happy to ask my questions. If I may. So thanks for a fascinating talk, Neil. So just to give you an indication where this question is coming from, I work both on questions of income distribution from a perspective of distributive justice and on tax competition, including the impact it has on distribution. And one narrative that we see in the tax competition literature is that the financial crisis kind of gave a jolt to governments, and they're looking to recuperate lost revenue. And so what they did is they tried to boost transparency. And one example of this that we see is in 2014, the OECD passed this automatic information exchange agreement. And there's a lot of people who would suggest that, at least with respect to individual taxation, this is a big step forward. Now, my question for you is, would we be able to use your methodology? I mean, you do this over more than 100 years, right? But we could also do it over the last 15 years. Could we use your methodology to see whether the enforcement mechanisms that are being taken are effective? Does the 2014 OECD measure, does it show up as a break in your data? Right? And if not, then would we be able to conclude that maybe other measures such as a wealth registry would be necessary? Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. So, I mean, just thinking about English history, there were kind of, it is interesting that you have this very kind of peculiar public disclosure of people's wealth at death. The kind of, the event that kind of relates to your question that on this is that what happens is you get a centralization of all wealth recorded at death in England in 1858. It was previously at the local county level. And then you have one place in London where you can just walk in and inspect the books, and now they put it online. And you can order the wills and probates, which is actually how I got into this. So, I'm not going to do an intellectual history of my own work, but that's it. Let's leave it there. But basically, what's amazing is that as you go through time, they move in the early 90s to microfiche, and those things are just impossible to kind of search in a kind of an interesting way, and you can barely read them, and the machines are half broken and no one cares. But as you go into the early 2000s, they go to computerized records. Those computerized records don't report the estate value. So after you have 2 centuries, because it starts around 1795, where you're getting very serious estimates of people's wealth. Okay, now there might be inter vivos bequests, but like they professionally value these things and they revalue them and they take it very seriously. And it's the early 2000s where this mysteriously disappears. Do you think that so it's like in many ways, the trend over time has been to get things more opaque in this country, which was historically more transparent. But I mean, I think, to answer, so that's the kind of history of England, which I think relates to this case that you're saying. In many ways, you couldn't do it in England, if this transparency test, because you're not seeing any estimates of wealth anymore. So I think, if they had such a change in England, you could, using a standard, which I've kind of, I guess the analog, which I've mentioned several times, is I'm writing several papers using RDD. You presumably could use a regression discontinuity design if you have a specific break using the logic of the methodology I outlined to see if it's having an effect, yes. So that's a very long answer. The answer is yes.
That's great. No trouble with the long answers. Perfectly fine. I was kind of curious, since I'm a newbie to this general area. It seems that the name Gabriel Zucman comes up all the time. Could you do a simple primer on what the difference in your work and their work would be, just in terms of its scope and in terms of its ability to make statements that there is hidden wealth and that it is of this import?
Yeah,
to
so
the
like,
distribution.
sorry, very briefly. So there isn't a huge amount of work on this, is the point. It's you're measuring something that's invisible, right? So you're measuring by shadows, and as soon as you do something like that, you're leaving yourself open to anybody. You know, in this, academia is competitive. People like to see solid things, and this is kind of measuring something that isn't there, right? So you're leaving yourself very open by working on this. So Zucman's relatively unique, and he's kind of really established this, and he's kind of, he's really a superstar in this stuff. If you look at his citation trajectory, he's a good bit younger than me, and he's got about 7,000 Google Scholar citations. But my general interpretation of what he's done in terms of his original work, which is looking at macro data, looking at systematic anomalies in macro measurements of different kind of wealth flows between countries. And he was able to kind of, in a very simple way, I don't think there's much like super technical going on. I think it's a bunch of Excel calculations. You can find out the estimates. I think his estimate from the 2013 paper was about 8% of household wealth seems to be in offshore tax havens, looking at these wealth flows and the systematic anomalies between them. What is more kind of comparison to my work is the work he did with Alsetter et al. And that was based on a data leak from HSBC in one of the Nordic countries. It might have been Sweden, it might have been Norway, one of them. And basically that was actually a very kind of small data leak. It's about 600 account holders. And you basically got their wealth information and also their offshore holdings as well. And again, it was just very simple. And that's where you get this relationship that the top 1% are holding, around about 25% of their wealth offshore. And that corresponds to mine. Mine is different in the sense that I have constructed all wealth in England from 1858, in this paper from 1892 to 1992. And I've got like a very thorough population level estimate at this dynastic level. It's also not just offshore wealth. I'm estimating hidden wealth from the perspective of wealth that isn't showing up in these probate calendars. So it could be legal. It's actually just portfolio rearrangement, and it could be illegal. So when I say hidden, it's not necessarily, it could be in a trust, as with the Grosvenor family, which is very famous, public knowledge. We all know that money is in a trust. So basically it's slightly different definitionally, but it's I don't, these papers aren't necessarily in competition, although I suspect people like to guard their territory, and I suspect anyway. But I think that this is, how many people in the world are working on this, empirical estimates of this is across Britain across 100 years. So that's how it fits in. But not much that's out there.
No, that's great. I really appreciate that explanation. It's quite clear then what the difference is, and in particular what the N difference is between your two papers. Fairly substantial, I would think. I see Hilary Silver has asked a general question of you, moving on from Zucman to, of course, Piketty, the discussion of the wealth tax itself. In particular, have you heard about or seen our Janet Yellen's proposal for a global wealth tax? And what does your study say, or what does your brain say about that?
So actually, I was kind of I'm actually not familiar with Janet Yellen's proposal. I must look it up. But I heard of Liz Warren and so forth, people proposing, the West Wall. But this Janet Yellen news, that seems like interesting. I think like a global wealth tax, if you want to tax wealth, it has to be done at a global level. I think this is like child logic right here. It's not complicated. So I perfectly agree that if that's what you want to do as a society, based on how you think the distributed tax affects. You have to in a global, and in many ways I go further. If you want to tax wealth, you either do it at a global level or you just forget about it. Because I think the negative effects of taxing wealth on your own domestic economy, you'll just get all the negative effects without the positive effects if you just attempt to do it. Potentially, that's one interpretation here. But I would also kind of, I mean, from a global perspective, as an economic historian, and I know this from my teaching, I tend to often teach these macroeconomic history courses for some reason, despite my work being primarily micro-related, as you can see. But we always muse about this European golden age of economic growth that was associated with the 1950s up until the first oil shocks, the early 1970s. The economy grew at this spectacularly high rate of growth, perhaps because there was lots of low-hanging fruit in relation to women entering the labor force, educational effects, and the transition from agricultural economies to service and industry economies, which it was still happening post-Second World War, even in France, for example. Now, this was also associated with very, very, very high wealth taxation. Now, these are just correlations as we look over European macro history. The deadweight loss of taxation of wealth tax doesn't show up in having any discernible effects on the macroeconomy. Now, England had missed the golden age, but in Europe, where we have very high wealth taxes, it didn't seem to matter. And based on just my speculation about how people work, people compete for status. Why do we write papers that very few people read, and we spend all of our time on them? It's great to have this is why it's so nice to talk about these things, which everybody ignores outside of this group. But we're competing for status. It's not particularly rational. And what I forward to is that this logic works for rich people. People compete to do things, interesting things. Money tracks it. You can tax it at 99%. They'll still get up in the morning and start companies, I think. But I mean, I know that this would generate a very heated reaction from certain of our colleagues. But that's my sense of how the world works, which is not coming from the paper. It's just maybe more pub talk. But I hope
that's fine.
We're
we're having trouble because we don't have pubs right now, and or at least maybe not in the current round of this pandemic. But the fact is that this is a good occasion for us to act like that upon occasion. It's good to just let it all out. One final question I was curious about just myself. I love the focus at the lower end in the middle of the distribution. This is really important because so many people are so concerned at the top 1%, top 10%, whatever, that at the end of the day, they forget what I consider to be the more important part of the distribution of wealth, which is where people have nothing to fall back on at all, or people have meager amounts to fall back on. So they're one shock away from big things happening. That's been a really interesting part of your paper. So I wondered if you wanted to just have a quick riff on that, and then I'll turn it back to the discussants. Yes, and as Hillary points out in the chat, worse that it's debt for those people. It isn't just having zero. Of course, for the people at the bottom end, they're walking upside down in the Penn Parade, if you look at it in terms of wealth. So comments on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was really the prime focus of Where is the Middle Class paper. And I mean, I think and I kind of pulled myself back from the brink a little bit because I need to get through a lot of slides. But basically on that, I mean, I've been quite surprised. I think people who are interested in this, I mean, they didn't know it before. Where did the decline of the 1% go in terms of the wealth share? So I've been quite surprised at reading through this literature and seeing that no one really talks about it. If you look at all the work of Anthony Atkinson, the books, and even Piketty, although in the latest book, he does start to talk about this a little bit more. And empirically, we've just fudged it because we know it's very hard to measure wealth for the average person because a lot of this is kind of not being taxed or not being surveyed, or it's very low level, but that itself is information. And what is happening? You've got high tax rates, and there's redistribution going in, but it's not being formed into wealth in a sense. It's being consumed because maybe there's unmet consumption needs, or maybe it's funding education, or people are still, the average person is up till the late 90s dying with actually no probatable wealth, which is less than £5,000, which after a lifetime in terms of furniture or a car doesn't really mount to a huge amount of what we would think of being a significant. It's a lot bigger than things before. So I thought it was an interesting discovery. And I'd also just say, I mean, I think that like we're all, you know, I mean, we all have diverse backgrounds, but we're all quite, as academics, in this nice position. And when I was like telling people about this kind of result, about like this missing middle class from England, people actually sometimes have a very kind of strong reaction to it. And they tell me it's impossible. And I think there's a psychological effect, is that we think that everyone else is like us. And I think unless you've looked at wealth distributions, if you looked at the data, if you've gone in to see how the vast majority of people live, you don't really, you find it hard to accept. I mean, I got some pushback maybe in referee reports on the paper, which shocked me, because I was like, some people seem, well, of course, and then other people were shocked, because I think there is a well-known psychology studies that we just think that everyone has our standard of living, that's normal. Even the very richest seem to think, well, everybody has 3 houses and so forth. But I mean, to me, I think I agree, it was completely very important.
Thank you so much for your comments, and I will just ask if Jonathan, Marina, and even Trevor, as our historian, has any final comments from their point of view, overview. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to the speaker for a final comment, and then we'll close.
Sure, I'll add
Marina.
I'll add just one thing, which is that my comments were more directed in a discussion way. I'm not, you know, like the relationship between income and wealth is very high, especially for 95% of the distribution, right? Even think about the fact that you say a lot of people in the middle class own a home. Okay, that's a form of wealth, and that share is much lower than it was before, certainly. And you own that home, well, maybe with a $400,000 mortgage. Is that really wealth if, you know, the home is then entirely on borrowed money? And my point was more that because your paper is so interesting and it has this novel contribution during such a turbulent time, I'm sure when you started gathering this data, there wasn't this like raging wealth tax debate that's happening literally right now. I'm sure that, you know, you'll have journalists knocking down your door to say, you think that 25% of wealth is hidden, 30%. Well, what do we do with that? And that's more of where my comments were headed.
Good. So I'll turn it back one last time, and then we'll close it down. Thank you, Neil. You have the last word before my goodbye.
Yeah, no, terrific. Just thank you so much. If anybody found this interesting, please, I'm working on a whole bunch of other stuff, including, I want to just mention, I'm using the individual level data to look at ethnic inequalities in wealth based on surname origins. And you see from very stark, and let's face it, not much research, particularly in England, inequalities that I know you guys are currently also discussing right now as well. So I'm looking forward to releasing that paper in the next few months. So I just thought I'd advertise that, but let me finish by thanking you so much. I really greatly appreciate this opportunity, and very much this is all work in progress. So I really appreciate the substantive comments you've given me today. Thank you very much.
Well, and thank you one and all for your presence here today. And we hope to see you next time in our Facing Inequality seminar series.